This conference will now be recorded.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this evening's program at the Mercer County Library System. We have a special program tonight. I do want to thank, there was a number of branches who made it possible for us to bring this program this evening. Each of the branches have friends groups, and the Friends of the Ewing branch, the Hickory Corner, Hopewell, Lawrence, as well as the Heightstown Library Association. They have all helped us sponsor this event tonight. So I wanted to make sure that I gave them credit. And like I said, I'm very excited for tonight's speaker. We have Dr. Chanelle Rose, who is an associate professor at the history department at Rowan University. Her areas of research and teaching include African American history, post-World War II America, civil rights, Black power, Africana studies, conservatism, tourism, and women's history. Her first book, The Struggle for Black Freedom in Miami, Civil Rights in America's Tourist Paradise, 1896 to 1968, was published by Louisiana State University Press in 2015. Her book examines the long struggle for civil rights in one of the country's most popular tourist destinations. Dr. Rose has also written several research articles which have appeared in such publications as the Journal of Social History and Florida Historical Quarterly. Her current research explores the evolution of modern conservatism in local communities and its impact on the African American struggle for racial equality from 1950 to 1985. Tonight, she has agreed to speak to us about the suffrage movement, which had a big anniversary last year. But what's interesting is tonight she's going to actually talk about the Black women's part of it. And so without further ado, Dr. Rose.
Thank you so much, Anna, and thank you to the Mercer County Library and all of the other libraries and branches that help to support this event, and especially thank you to the virtual audience who have decided to come this late in the evening at 7 p.m., usually I'm sure during dinner time, to come and listen to this talk, so I really appreciate it. So I'll jump right in and then leave some time for Q&A. So early splits within the suffrage movement converged along race and gender lines that revealed the deep divisions between Black and white women's experiences. Women's suffragists like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who had been deeply involved in the abolitionist movement for more than 2 decades, saw the political upheavals of the post-Civil War era as an opportunity to radically redefine American citizenship along not only racial lines, but also gender lines as well. But a split in the women's suffragist movement developed after the ratification of the 14th Amendment. And I have the first slide here that you can see 2 sections of the 14th Amendment outlined. So the amendment redefined US citizenship, as you can see in this first sentence of section 1, establishing birthright citizenship, because it made every person born in the United States, right, including formerly enslaved men and women, citizens, and also provided equal protection under the law. But for the first time, as you can see in section 2, and I've highlighted the word, the proposed amendment inserted the word male into the Constitution by declaring that all male citizens over 21 years old should be able to vote. Now, some white suffragists like Lucy Stone and Julia Ward Howe still supported the amendment, but others, especially Stanton and Anthony, were outraged and unsuccessfully tried to defeat it. Now, another rift emerged between some women's rights activists and many of those fighting for Black male suffrage when leading women suffragists protested the passage of the 15th Amendment in 1870 because it proposed to only enfranchise Black men. Again, Anthony and Stanton felt deeply betrayed by their, or for the first time, I should say, they felt deeply betrayed by their former male allies in the abolitionist movement because of their decision to relegate female suffrage to the back burner. And they stood on what they claimed was the highest moral ground by demanding universal suffrage. And Stanton argued that no one's liberation should take priority over another's. I should say a quite compelling and important argument that historians have debated and students in my U.S. history classes, right, also grapple with. However, their argument was undermined by the fact that Stanton and some other white suffragists, particularly educated women, resorted to using racist rhetoric to challenge the 15th Amendment. So Stanton, as you can see here on the right, and famed abolitionist Frederick Douglass on the left, who, by the way, was a staunch supporter of women's rights and had worked with Stanton on the, in women's rights and abolition before this time period. So they were actually close friends, but they had a bitter split over who should be the first to get the right to vote, right? Women or Black men. So during a heated debate at the meeting of the American Equal Rights Association in New York in 1869, Stanton gave the part, and I included part of the speech that she gave at the bottom so you can see the direct quote. And so she says, as it reads at the bottom right corner, "Shall American statesmen so amend their constitutions as to make their wives and mothers, right, the political inferiors of unlettered and unwashed ditch diggers, bootblacks, butchers, and barbers fresh from the slave plantations of the South?" I should also point out that in a letter to the editor of the New York Standard, this was just 2 years earlier in 1867, Stanton wrote, quote, "It is better to be the slave of an educated white man than of a degraded, ignorant Black one," end quote. Now, before responding to her remarks at the convention, Douglass paid tribute to Stanton's, years of work on abolition and civil rights for all, and then he replied, as you can see at the quote at the bottom of your screen in the bottom left, "When women, because they are women, are hunted down through the cities of New York and New Orleans, when they are dragged from their houses and hung from lampposts, when their children are torn from their arms and their brains dashed out upon the pavement, when they are objects of insult and rage at every turn, when they are in danger of having their homes burnt down, then they will have an urgency to obtain the ballot equal to our own." So Douglass clearly believed that the more urgent cause was obtaining the vote for Black men at the height of white supremacy in the South. And by extension, the vote for Black men, he believed, would seemingly protect Black women. Now, Black women suffragists had also felt betrayed and expressed opposition to the 15th Amendment, although many supported it. In a May 1867 speech to the American Equal Rights Association, you can see here famed abolitionist, women's suffragist, Sojourner Truth, as you can see again in the image on the right. She made this claim, right? Quote, there is a great stir about colored men getting their rights, but not a word about the colored women." So Sojourner Truth was one of these women suffragists who also addressed the plight of Black women and their vote. Similarly, if you look at the left, and you can see here a picture of Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, also an abolitionist, a poet, a writer, an activist, and she argued fervently and constantly that it was the women who stood most firmly for the principle of universal rights. But she also said, right, similar to Truth, quote, "As much as white women need the ballot, colored women need it more." And so she pleaded for this because of the importance of equal rights and equal education for Black women. So Black suffragists, like both of these women, did not view suffrage in the same way as their white counterparts. They were seeking the ballot, yes, for themselves, and but also for their men as a means of empowering Black communities that were besieged by the reign of racial terror that erupted after emancipation. Now, after the two dominant women's rights organizations merged, they had initially split because of the 15th Amendment. They merged to establish the National American Women's Suffrage Association in 1890. The racist and exclusionary practices of many white suffragists who became more concerned about securing white Southern support to strengthen their fight for the franchise, especially at the national level, that including Black women, alienated many Black suffragists. And in many ways, the growth of a nationally organized Black club women's movement that emerged in the 1890s was a direct result of this exclusion, right? But more importantly, a direct response to the belief that Black women played a special role in uplifting the race, and that votes for Black women would mean, regaining votes stolen from Black men who were being lynched and disenfranchised throughout Southern states. So if
Dr.
you,
Rose, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I just wanted to let you know that there's a box that has popped there. It's gone now. Okay. There was a box that was blocking the screen so we couldn't see the slides. I'm sorry to
oh,
interrupt you on a
I'm so
roll.
sorry. Okay, I'm so
Okay.
sorry.
No, no, no. Thank you.
Yes. So if you look at if you look at the image on the left, and you can see here a picture of Josephine Pierre Ruffin, as you can see, right, African American suffragist and the editor of the Women's Club era, which I'll talk about in a minute. She was born in Boston. She founded the Women's Era. This was the first newspaper published by and for African American women, and it served as a vehicle to document the achievements and showcase the strengths of the African American women. And it also, I think, adopted the slogan from the women's suffrage movement, right? Help to make the world better. So they focused on women's suffrage, race-related issues, including anti-lynching reform and social justice issues relating to education, and also related to racial inequality when it came to Jim Crow segregation. Now, Ruffin, she launched the Women's Era Club in Boston with her daughter, and she had stated that she joined, the Massachusetts suffragists because of the warm welcome she had received from white suffragist leaders like Lucy Stone and Julia Ward Howe and others. But in 1895, she convened the first conference of the National Federation of Afro-American Women. And this is an interesting story. She specifically did this because of the way that she had been, or Black women had been portrayed by the Missouri Press Association editor James Jacks, who wrote a widely publicized letter that denigrated Black women by referring to them as, prostitutes and natural liars and thieves. And so she became one of the key leaders in the Black club women's movement, that wanted to establish an organization where Black women could represent themselves, they could find their own voices, and they could speak to who they were and challenge some of these stereotypes about them. So a number of organizations that I've mentioned, some of them here, the Colored Women's League of Washington, the National Federation of Afro-American Women, I know it's a lot of different organizations, but they merged together and established, as you can see on the right, the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs. And the first president of that organization was Mary Church Terrell. And so that there's an image here of Mary Church Terrell on the right. And so she was born in Memphis, Tennessee. She was also the daughter of enslaved African Americans. And she served as the first president, along with Ruffin, who served as one of several vice presidents. And so its mission, right, the mission of the National Association of Colored Women was to demonstrate the existence, right, of a large number of educated, cultured women, but also their motto was lift as we climb, or lifting as we climb. So this idea that they wanted to lift up those who were not as educated, not as privileged, right? And it's interesting to use the word privilege when talking about an era of Jim Crow segregation and oppression, but these women were definitely more privileged than other women who were, working poor or working class. And so the idea was to uplift the race through this organization. Now, both women faced discrimination within the suffragist movement. But this did not deter Terrell from maintaining connections with white suffragists and accepting invitations, right, to speak before white groups that would invite her. So, for example, and I've taken or lifted a direct quote from Terrell at one of the events where she spoke. In 1904, she attended a convention, right, the National Association of Women's Suffrage Association in the District of Columbia. And so you can see, just to provide some context here, white delegates spoke of the problems of child and animal abuse. And so in response to a call for federal legislation to protect children and animals, you can see here the response that Terrell gives, right? And so she says, in quote, a resolution asks you to stand up for children and animals. I want you to stand up not only for children and animals, but also for Negroes. You will never get suffrage until the sense of justice has been so developed in men that they will give fair play to the colored race. So clearly you can see from this quote, right, that Terrell is linking the suffragist movement, right, to the struggle for rights for African Americans and sees these two movements or these two causes as inextricably linked, right? Whereas some white suffragists didn't always see that connection, or because of their privilege were not as insistent on making sure that the suffrage movement included the race question. Now, one of the most frequently cited examples of discrimination against Black female suffragists from white suffrage organizations was the infamous first suffrage parade in front of the White House in 1913 in Washington, D.C. And so the organizers of the march had asked Ida B. Wells, right? She's the famed Black female suffragist and anti-lynching crusader. They had asked her not to march with the white Chicago delegation. And the reason was fear of offending certain Southern women who had, pledged that they wouldn't march in a racially integrated parade. Now, there were a few white women who agreed with Barnett, but many others in the delegation thought she should march with her own race at the back of the parade. However, if you know anything about Ida B. Wells, being the fireball that she was, she decided to march and integrated the Illinois delegation. And you can actually see her where it's hard to identify which one she is here, but she's standing proud, right? I would say in the middle there, standing proud, walking in that parade. And she was also representing the Alpha Suffrage Clubs. This was the only Black women's club in Chicago, and I think who had actually sent her there as a representative. And I think it's important to point that out, because sometimes when we think about these Black women who were so influential in leading their people, we sometimes disassociate them from the other organizations that they were a part of. And so, yes, Ida B. Wells gets a lot of recognition, as she should, for her role in making this defiant position and marching, with the white women to show that she wasn't going to be at the back, but at the same time, she's part of a community, right, of Black women who helped to send her there to represent them and to be a voice for them. So Black suffragists fought against racism and sexism simultaneously, right? And this is a point that I had made a few minutes ago to show the difference between Black suffragists and many white suffragists. And so despite their, middle class background of many of them, the Sojourner Truths, well, not Sojourner Truth, but especially, Frances Harper, thinking about Mary Church Terrell, Anna Julia Cooper, and other women who were definitely part of the Black middle class, they became trailblazers of what we now call intersectional feminism, right? And this was before the kind of, Alice Walkers, I'm sorry, and Bell Hooks and, Kimberly Crenshaw, some of these women that we may be more familiar with today, we can look back decades and see that some of these women were linking the importance of race and gender long before terms like intersectionality became, vogue or part of the language that we use today. In vogue or part of the language used today. So I want to close by spending a few minutes discussing the legacy of the 19th Amendment and the need for the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And so I've kind of juxtaposed these two images, and I'll talk about why I think it's important to have this somewhat of a contrast. So even though the 19th Amendment gave white women and some Black women, particularly those Black women in the North and Midwest, the right to vote, it would take another half century, right? A new suffrage campaign with Black women playing a leading role before the Black community was fully enfranchised through the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965. Members of Congress, state lawmakers, and suffragists themselves, they were well aware of the open interpretation of the 19th Amendment that allowed for the continuation of loopholes, right, like poll taxes, literacy tests, understanding clauses, right, that were all designed to disenfranchise and prevent Black people from being able to vote. And so the landmark legislative achievement of the Voting Rights Act is often regarded as the most important civil rights law in the nation's history. And most Americans typically associate its passage, right, with the 1965 Selma to Montgomery March, also known as Bloody Sunday, because, and understandably so, right, because the public outcry at the televised attack by state troopers on peaceful marches in Selma gained national and international attention that ultimately empowered and put pressure on President Johnson and compelled Congress to initiate meaningful and effective voting rights legislation. So on the right is one of the most iconic pictures of that period, and it shows former Congressman John Lewis, as you can see here, who was the SNCC chairman at the time, being brutally beaten by Alabama state troopers after leading the march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge with 600 other peaceful protesters who were trying to bring attention and dramatize to the nation the denial of African Americans to vote in Alabama. But on the left is a less familiar image of the dynamic Fannie Lou Hamer, who you can see up front holding the mic, who developed a reputation as a heroic civil rights and women's rights activist. She had lost her job as a timekeeper working on a plantation near Ruralville, Mississippi in Sunflower County, for attempting to register to vote, right, in the 1960s. So even though the 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote, Black women like Fannie Lou Hamer, right, still couldn't vote in the South. And as a Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee field secretary, she crisscrossed the country speaking to fellow Black farm workers about the importance of voting. So the voter suppression and racial terror committed against Black Mississippians compelled activists and local people like Hamer to establish the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. And so if you look at the caption at the bottom of this picture here, you can see that it's this image is from the Democratic Convention in Atlantic City in 1964, and you can see representatives of the MFDP, including Fannie Lou Hamer, who's holding the mic, right, who went to the convention to try and unseat the all-white delegates who they believe did not fairly represent all of Mississippians, including or particularly African Americans. Some of you may recognize Congressman Eleanor Holmes Norton, who's actually standing behind Fannie Lou Hamer, and then also Black Power activist Stokely Carmichael, later changed his name to Kwame Ture. He has the hat on, standing at the far back. And of course, the matriarch, right, Ella Baker, who has on those powerful, very classy looking dark glasses. And she was a longtime activist, one of the matriarchs of SNCC. And really all of these individuals were there to not only challenge the all-white delegation, but to say something about the denial of Black Mississippians when it came to the right to vote. So we should, right, and I'll show this image here, we should definitely remember John Lewis, as I showed in the previous image. We should remember, of course, Dr. Martin Luther King, who you can see here as President Johnson is signing the voting rights bill, and of course Johnson and all of them who were instrumental in its passage. But I think we also shouldn't forget the significant role of Black women in obtaining the vote that is sometimes left out of this narrative, right? If you look at the image on the left, not deterred by the setback in Atlantic City, they were not successful. They only received 2 seats, and that's not what they went there for. The following year, right, in 1965, the same year, and this is before the passage of the Voting Rights Act, these women, right, Hamer, you can see here Jackson Gray Adams on the left, and to the far right, Annie Robinson Devine, they returned to DC, right? They came to DC and returned as part of the MFDP to challenge the seating of representatives from Mississippi at the 89th Congress. And so again, putting pressure on the government to address the need for a Voting Rights Act because of the kind of suppression taking place in parts of the South, particularly Mississippi. We should also, right, remember civil rights activists and Black women who play such an important role, like Septima Clark, who you can see here on the left, who developed the literacy and citizenship workshops that played a key role in the drive for voting rights and civil rights for African Americans. And I can say a little bit more about her during Q&A if you like. And also, of course, Shirley Chisholm, right, who became, and you can see her picture on the right, the first Black woman elected to the US Congress in 1968. And in 1972, the first Black candidate for a major party's nomination, a first Black woman and Black candidate for a major party's nomination for President of the United States. And her motto and title of her autobiography, which was Unbossed and Unbought, I think illustrates her outspoken advocacy for women and minorities during her term in office. And I'll close by showing an image that's more up to date, and I'm sure many of you especially recognize the woman on the right, if not the woman on the left. These women trailblazers who I've been talking about, right, Fannie Lou Hamer, or going back to, Ida B. Wells, they really paved the way for former Congressman Stacey Abrams, who you can see on the right, and LaTosha Brown, who I'll say a little bit more about on the left. And the list could go on for Vice President Kamala Harris, for women like Melissa Harris Perry or Alicia Garza, who's part of Black Lives Matter. I mean, the list goes on. And so I think they are part of this legacy, right? Stacey Abrams, who I believe is featured in 2 documentaries on voter suppression on Netflix that's still going on. She and other Georgia organizers, right, are part of this long but often overlooked tradition of Black women working for the vote, right? I think of, when the count of the Georgia votes for former Vice President Biden overtook those of incumbent Donald Trump, the congratulations, right, that began kind of rolling out, they weren't only directed at Biden's camp, right? They went to Stacey Abrams, they went to other Black women who she was organizing with, who had been involved in, helping to get Black turnout, in trying to address voter suppression. And so they were really critical in helping the Democrats win not only the White House, but also the historic Georgia runoff elections. And so I think, Abrams didn't do this work herself. Many other women were part of that organizing. So one of those women would be LaTosha Brown, as you can see here on the left, right, co-founder of Black Voters Matter. And so her work really was focused on power building in these Southern-based communities through civic engagement. And her organization, again, along with Abrams and others, and you can see some of the work that she's done, was really important in the kind of turnout that we saw in these elections. So I would say, as we celebrate Black History Month, and half the country, I believe, also celebrates the preservation of U.S. democracy following the election of President Joe Biden. At least half of the country who believes that to be true, and I think it's important to understand in that context the value and legacy of Black women fighting for social justice that continues to carry on today and in the future, I'm sure. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rose. That was so educational, and I loved how it spun to the current situation and the currency of it. So I really do appreciate your presentation. I have questions, but at this point,
Stop. I'm gonna see if I can stop sharing so that you can
perfect. Okay, so Dr. Rose has stopped sharing her presentation, and at this point, we are going to do a
you all see
Q&A.
me?
Can
Can
you
you
still
all
see?
see me? Okay. Okay, great.
So at this point, if you would have any questions, you can either remember, I do want to remind people that I am recording. You can turn your camera off or turn your mic off and pose your question that way. Or there is a way to write a question out in the text chat box over to where there's a speech bubble that you can click on and see that. So I already have a couple. Well, first of all, I have to tell you, I've got a few people saying excellent presentation and thank yous and kudos. And so really, so thank you. So the first question I have written on the side here is, can you talk a little bit about Harriet Tubman's activity within the suffrage movement? Oh, we lost your audio. Hold on, Dr. Rose, we can't hear you.
Oh my
Oh,
gosh.
there you go. I
Harriet
hear you
Tubman's
now.
Now I haven't, this is a, oh.
Oh, shoot, you're going out.
Okay. No, this is, I feel bad because this is a great question, but I haven't come, oh no. Ooh.
We see you.
Can you see me, hear me?
Oh yeah, we can see you. I can hear you now, yes. Oh shoot, now you're gone again.
Okay.
Well, I can see, oh, there it is, okay.
Oh, what, you've been this whole time. This is so crazy. Yeah, can you hear me, Anna?
Yes.
Yeah, I was gonna say I haven't come across as much of Tubman's work in the suffrage movement. I know she passed in when she passed like in 1912, 1913, and so she was a little bit up in age at that time. So I don't know how involved she was in the suffragist movement, even though I'm sure, that's something that I definitely need to do more research on to see how active she was in those later years, because typically you'll see, Sojourner Truth, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, and some of these Mary Church Terrell and some of these other women, but I haven't seen as much on Tubman's activism. And so that's really a great question.
Thank
I'm sorry,
you.
I could provide more detail on that.
So then I have someone asking, can you talk a little more about Septima Clark?
Yeah, so in 1957, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference (SCLC) decided it was founded, and this was it was at the head was Dr. Martin Luther King, and then you had other ministers who were part of the leadership. And this was on the kind of following the success of the Montgomery bus boycott. And so they were trying to decide what to focus on as far as their agenda. And they chose they chose enfranchisement, the vote, right? And so they called it Crusade for Citizenship. And as they were putting together this crusade for citizenship. I should also point out that that Ella Baker, who I had mentioned before, was instrumental in the founding of SCLC, and she saw the crusade for citizenship as really important, but she felt that there wasn't enough organizing or real time being focused on developing that program. And so Septima Clark really is instrumental in giving the crusade for citizenship life and the kind of infrastructure that it needed in order to be successful, or as successful as it could be. And so that image that I showed you of her, if you remember, she was sitting with African Americans in a classroom, helping them develop literacy, but not just through reading and writing, but also literacy as far as civic engagement, as far as their political rights, learning about their history. And so she was a former teacher in South Carolina. She had also, witnessed some of the repression of the teachers, particularly those who were part of the NAACP that state came under. And so I think Septima Clark is one of those figures who doesn't get the same acknowledgement as, say, others who were kind of on the front lines for the struggle to vote, but really trying to provide the kind of training and education that was so vital to many of these poor Southern communities. She really was at the forefront of making that happen.
Very interesting. Thank you. And let's see, I've got a few more here. What are your thoughts on the fact that white women comprise 40% of the slave owners in America, not just the South? What influence do you think the role of white women in slavery had on their opposition to Black women's human rights?
Yeah, I mean, I think that
It's a great question.
great question. It's a great question. I think that just as many white men were invested in white supremacy and invested in maintaining the system of inequality in the South, that many of these white women were also invested in those same privileges, not to the same extent because of obviously patriarchy and the denial of women's rights across the board in many areas. But I think the privilege of these women, especially white women who are in this class where they were slave owners, whether through, being a widow or inheriting it from, family or whatever, that they had, I think that legacy of being in a position of power and seeing, not only being in a position of power, but now having that power dynamic be challenged by giving Black men the right to vote before these white women. And we also know that, along with the privilege of whiteness that crossed gender lines, this sense of, seeing white women as being put on a pedestal, or as being kind of the symbol of the South when it came to, race relations and what was most to be protected, right? We see that especially with lynching that evolves after the end of Reconstruction. And one of the main reasons that whites would give for lynching Black men and women, but more so Black men, was that they had been accused of raping white women. As I talked about, Ida B. Wells being one of the anti-lynching crusaders of her generation, not just in the US, but she would travel throughout the world, kind of, bringing attention to this issue. She wrote a very detailed description of lynching in the South, and she went case by case, looking at, individuals or groups, and she was able to document that in many of these cases, men or women were lynched for, challenging the racial order, or for being in competition with whites when it came to owning a business, or when it came to them, being perceived as stepping out of line or being uppity. And so, she was able to kind of demonstrate that through her work. So I think, this idea of Southern womanhood and Southern white womanhood particularly, also plays into that. I think it was really, to kind of come back to another point that I think is important. Yes, there were definitely white women who believed that universal suffrage should have been the way that the country, or what Republicans focused on, and wanted suffrage for both Black men and women. But I think they were also very much a part of their historical moment in time. And so, it really was not I guess an injustice, but also a threat or disrespect to their own identity to have Black men be given a right or to vote before acknowledging or giving that to white women.
Thank you. Excellent question. There's a comment that I don't know if you can see the comments coming in, but I agree with this one, that very informative. Love the path to the present women still on the journey for voting rights of African Americans. And I want to second that comment on the presentation. This is one of my questions, and actually someone else is asking this, is, are there any books that you can recommend for us to further explore this topic?
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely look at Rosalind Terborg Penn's book. It's this is, I guess, a more dated version, but still considered, I think, one of the seminal works on the role of Black women in the right to vote. I don't know if, can I type Rosalind Terborg Penn, just to say that again. Also, there's a new book that, gosh, I'm trying to think, when did this come out? Maybe it just came out last year, I want to say. And this is by Martha, I don't want to forget her name. Oh my gosh. Her last name is escaping me right now, but it'll come back to, yes, Rosalind Terborg Penn. That's how you spelled it correctly. I'm looking in the chat box here. Let me hold up. I'm kind of looking my notes here if I can, because her work is so while I'm thinking about her name, also Deborah Gray White has written on the history of Black women, and not just the vote, but their role in the struggle for civil rights. I'm also thinking of Deborah Gray White, Rosalind Terborg Penn, other key, of course, kind of more up to date, I would think of Anna Julia Cooper. So this is not historian writing, but definitely Anna Julia Cooper's A Voice from the South, that was written in the late 1800s. I didn't have time to talk about her, but Anna Julia Cooper is a Black woman who often is credited for this idea of intersectionality that I talked about before it became a term that was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in the 21st century. And so I think in that text, she talks about the important role of Black women, particularly in the uplift of the race. And she talks about the important role, particularly at a time, as I pointed out, when Black men were really under attack. And so I think her work is really important too. And I'm sure some others will come up as we continue to talk. I'll kind of think of others who I think would be really helpful.
Thank you so much. And then this is an interesting question. Can you speak to the sororities' involvement in the suffrage march?
Yeah. So the this is an area that I haven't done. Yeah, this is such an important. I haven't done as much, but I'm thinking, of course, Delta Sigma Theta, and the AKAs. These women, I think, these organizations worked very closely with, or some overlapping between them and the Black women's clubs organizations in fighting for suffrage, in kind of taking on this mantle of, lifting as we climb. I think, yeah, there's a lot to, and I would say too, I mean, kind of moving forward, I think of, the role of sororities in the 1960s and 1970s and during the civil rights struggle, and these civic organizations were so important, I think, in continuing to provide some of that infrastructure, but also some of that leadership that was so critical at this time. Before I forget, it just jumped out. Martha Jones. Martha Jones is another book that you should definitely look at. And she looks at the vote specifically, but Black women and their role in the vote. And I think it was just published either this year or last year. Sorry, I didn't want to forget that since it
That's
jumped back.
fine. No, I appreciate that. I've been typing the authors' names in the chat box for people too, so they can write them down. I have a few more. Are you okay taking a few more?
Yeah.
Okay. Where would history place Flo Kennedy in the fight for Black women's suffrage?
Flo Kennedy. I'm trying to think. I haven't done. That's a great question. Again, you guys are asking so many great questions. I'm trying to think. Oh my gosh, these are names that I have to. I mean, I think definitely her work. I'm not as familiar. I have to say, I'm not as familiar as her work, but I'm thinking definitely as someone who, was from the West, at least born in the West. I'm not sure how much time she spent outside of that area, but and then I think she later, let me see, I think Flo Kennedy later moved to New York, so she was very much involved in or nurtured in that kind of climate of activism that we see taking place in New York. And I think she very much, I would say, similar to Anna Julia Cooper and some of these other Black women who had this kind of intersectionality approach to their activism, that she also, didn't separate, gender from race, and saw, and not just that, but I think, seeing the ways in which that it was important to recognize how those things interlocked, and to use that as a way to kind of continue the fight for voting. And so I think feminism and civil rights, right, at a time where not all Black women who were engaged in civil rights were definitely feminists, but I think that she had more of that kind of feminist consciousness. And then she would, later, also kind of be heavily influenced by Black Power and those voices too. So I think she kind of runs the gamut.
Thank you so much. And I do want to make sure that people are looking into the chat, because people are submitting some great resources that people can use for further research on the topic. So I want to thank you for the group effort. I really do appreciate
I'm
it.
missing the chat here. Which icon is the chat so I can see all these?
It's a little speech bubble kind of, and it should be in your top right-hand corner.
Right-hand corner. Okay.
It looks like a
Okay,
comic
great.
book speech bubble. Okay.
Yeah, I see it. I see it.
And so I've got a couple more questions, and then we'll let you go, Dr. Rose.
Okay. I hope I can answer. They're so great. I'm like, I need to do more research on some of these.
All it's done is excited me to go and do some more research. So I appreciate everything all the comments and questions so far. And this is interesting. So this is kind of what is the current situation in New Jersey with voting rights? For example, are there effective alliances of white and Black women working together as sisters in the ongoing struggle? I think that's an interesting question, because you did talk about that with the intersectionality. So it's such a, that must have been such a rift, to try and bridge that. And I wonder if it still does happen. So I think that's a great question. Thank you.
Yeah, that is a great question. I'm more, even though I don't live in Miami anymore, I've been kind of more plugged into, what's been happening in Miami. Now, I have my research and some of the classes that I teach are focused on Camden. So I have become involved in some of the work through the efforts of the NAACP and other organizations. But I don't know how much. I'm not as plugged into the kind of the political organizing to know which groups are, you know, focused on voting rights or voting suppression. So that's again a great question, but I'm not as plugged into the kind of New Jersey circles to know exactly if there is that kind of interracial alliance
Right.
or organizing going on here. But I would be very curious to find out for sure.
And the last question for the evening. Do you know of any well-known men, white or black, that are allies to the suffrage movement?
Yeah, I mean, I had mentioned Frederick Douglass
Right.
for sure, who was, you know, a great ally in the suffrage movement. Someone who I think I had said, you know, was really good friends with um, Elizabeth Cady Stanton until, you know, this split. I think of, you know, Wendell Phillips, who was president of the American Anti-Slavery Society, and he supported the 15th Amendment and believed that it was kind of the Negro hour. And so he was very much in support of the suffrage movement too. But because of, you know, the split that happens, that relationship kind of, you know, fizzles out. And so you see that, I think, where um, some of those relationships and those alliances that had been established because of the suffrage movement originating really with the abolitionist movement and many of those women getting their organizing and early activism in that movement. Once you have the passage of the 15th Amendment, that really becomes like a moment where you see a split taking place. So those are the two individuals that come to mind immediately.
Well,
Even
once
though I should
again, oh,
say
go ahead. I'm
Lucy,
sorry.
you know, I would also say, you know, white women like Lucy Stone, you know, were outraged that, you know, were also, how would I say, they were also upset about the 15th Amendment, but continued to support it. So you do have examples of women, Harriet Beecher Stowe, Lucy Stone, and other white women who would continue to support Black men and Black women in the suffrage movement and saw it as more holistic. I would say Jane Addams of Hull House in Chicago, right, another white woman who I think was an important advocate for both and was very much a part of the founding of the NAACP, along with W.E.B. Du Bois, another Black male who was very much in support of the suffrage movement. But again, saw the importance. I mean, he was kind of he was much younger at that time, but I think would continue to be a strong advocate. Du Bois being the co-founder of the NAACP, and also the editor of the Crisis magazine, which was the main newspaper for the organization, continued to be a strong advocate for women's suffrage and for the right to vote for all women and particularly for Black women.
Once again, thank you so much for the presentation and for fielding the questions that everyone had. And again, I do want to recommend that people look into the chat box to see the resources that were shared. Dr. Rose, it was a pleasure. Thank you so
Oh,
much for
great.
speaking
Thank
this
you so
evening.
much. I hope I was able to answer some of these questions that I wish I knew more of the answers to.
You've just piqued our interest for more. That's all. Then that's okay.